And now, coming to you, this is...
Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. How are we all feeling out there today? I'm actually recording this on a Friday, so I'm super excited because it's almost the weekend for me. And you know, if you guys are listening to this on Thursday, it's almost the weekend for you all too. So I hope you're having a good day, wherever and whenever you're listening to this episode. So today we're actually going to be talking about the last of the 1930s Nancy Drew movies. This one is called Nancy Drew, The Hidden Staircase. This is the fourth movie out of 4 movies total, and it came out in 1939. I don't know, I'm a little bit sad that this is going to be the last 1930s movie we're covering. I wish there were more, but I've really enjoyed talking about these with you all. I'm usually not an old black and white movie buff, but these have really surprised me. I really enjoyed them, and I think they flowed really well, because sometimes like earlier movies in Hollywood, they were kind of disjointed, they didn't make sense to me at least, but I really liked them, and this makes me excited to cover more Nancy Drew movies in the near future. So a quick fun fact about The Hidden Staircase: this is taken from the second Nancy Drew book, and this is actually the most adapted Nancy Drew book that I'm aware of. The plot from that book was also made into a movie that came out in 2019 that starred Sophia Lillis. We'll definitely cover that on later episodes of the podcast. But I watched the movie trailer for The Hidden Staircase because that was on the edition of the DVD that I have, and it says, "There's been a murder in this house, and it's haunted too." That's the tagline on the screen. So I was very excited to see how this book to movie adaptation stacks up against the first movie, which was also a book to movie adaptation for The Password to Larkspur Lane. So you'll have to wait till the end of the episode before I give my thoughts on that. But we'll go ahead and we'll talk about some of the cast for this movie. Of course, Bonita Granville is still playing Nancy Drew. Frankie Thomas is playing Ted Nickerson. I appreciate that they kept the same actors for the main characters, because sometimes that does not happen, like with the 1970s TV show, which, I mean, there's reasons that happened. But John Little is still playing Carson Drew. Effie is still played by Renee Riano. Frank Orth is still playing Captain Tweedy, and we have Miss Floretta and Miss Rosemary Turnbull, the sisters, played by Louise Carter and Vera Lewis. There's a reporter played by John Ridgely. Phillips is a character played by Dawn Rowan, Daniel Talbert, who is the neighbor, played by William Gold, and McKeever, who's played by Dick Elliott. Alright, we'll go ahead and jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took for Nancy Drew, The Hidden Staircase from 1939. So our movie starts with some reporters getting out, and they're buzzing the doorbell at the Drews' residence. Effie answers, and they ask to talk to Nancy, but they swarm Effie in the meantime, and they bombard her with questions until Carson walks in, calmly drinking some tea. The reporters tell Carson they've been asking his daughter some questions, talking about Effie, and Carson interjects, "That's not my daughter. Do I look old enough to be her father?" Ouch. So now Effie is an idiot and old, according to Carson. A little bit harsh. But the reporters say they've heard a rumor that Floretta and Rosemary Turnbull were going to give the old Turnbull estate to Dr. Spires for a children's hospital, and Nancy convinced them to do it. So about that time, perfect timing, Nancy comes trotting down that grand staircase that I've talked about in previous episodes about these movies, and Carson says, "Well, here comes the guilty party now. You can talk to her." So the reporters take Nancy's picture and show her an article in the paper about what they're talking about. Carson clarifies and says Zachary Turnbull's daughters, Floretta and Rosemary, must live in the mansion 20 years, according to the will, before claiming ownership of the property. And, this is an interesting clause, one sister must always remain nightly over the course of those 20 years. Dang! So, they're not going on vacation. If one of them goes, like, to see a friend or something, one of them has to stay at the house. Kind of an odd clause to put in a will, but okay. But the reporters eventually leave, and Effie catches one of them at the door and says if any of the pictures of her turn out to be good, she'll buy one. And then he says if they are, he'll give her a dozen. And then she takes this as an insult and slams the door. So Nancy and Carson continue talking at the table, and Nancy asks how the sisters could even prove that they were there every night over all those years. And Carson says neighbors signed affidavits saying they were witnesses to this. This is wild. But Effie goes to the store for the Drews after this, and we see Carson has accidentally walked off and left his briefcase at the table. Nancy notices and tries to catch him by yelling out the window, but Carson drives off and doesn't hear her. So a few minutes after this, a man in a suit comes and knocks on the door, saying he's a reporter in order to get Nancy to let him in. But then he grabs Nancy roughly by the arm and tells her to give him the affidavits. She cries out and tries to telephone the police, but the man wrestles it from her. He demands to know where they are, and he says he knows Carson didn't take the affidavits with him, and they weren't at his office. So this guy has searched Carson's office, apparently, and was staking out the house. The creep factor on this is through the roof. But this does take pretty directly from the original text, the scene where Nathan Gambit comes into Nancy's house and basically wrestles her for these important documents in Carson's office. So Nancy, as we know, tried to get Carson's attention, so she had sat them on the couch. So she sits on top of them so this man can't see where they are while he searches the room. Now about that time, Nancy sees an ice delivery truck pull up being driven by Ted. So she hangs a sign in the window that says River Heights 150 and Ice Company. So if this isn't a sign of the times, it's crazy to think about people getting blocks of ice delivered to their house back in the day. Also, Ted has a job now. He's supporting himself. He's out here working for this ice delivery company. But yeah, I guess you would just hang this sign up in the window and you would let them know how much ice you needed for the week. So Ted sees the sign and whistles, I guess, at how much ice it is, and he starts unloading the truck. About this time, the man notices Nancy's acting strange, so he pulls her off the couch and grabs the affidavits. Then several things happen at once. Ted comes to the door saying, "Iceman!" Nancy bites the man's hand and grabs the affidavits. She runs away with them, and then Ted drops this huge block of ice, which slides across the floor, knocking this guy down. So Nancy and Ted run out to the front yard, and they see the man taking off in his car as they're there talking. Carson shows back up and says he forgot his briefcase, and he seems surprised to see Nancy in the yard with it. She tells him what happened, and Carson says he'll call the police. It's really funny because as Carson turns to go back to the house, Ted is worried about the huge block of ice that's just laying in the floor, and Nancy tells her dad Ted dropped a little ice on the rug. And Carson says, that's okay, I'll throw it in the ice bucket, not realizing it's a huge chunk of ice. Ted makes the comment like he's gonna find an iceberg when he goes in there. But then, in true Nancy fashion, at least in these movies, she ropes Ted into her schemes and she asks him to take her to the Turnbull's house so she can warn them about this guy who is clearly out to get their property. So as Nancy gets in the ice truck with him, she tells Ted he should have gotten a more genteel job, but then Ted brags that he doesn't do so bad as the Iceman, and he shows Nancy this pie tin with a leftover piece of pie in it. He got this as a tip from a customer, I'm assuming. But Nancy and Ted go to the Turnbull's house and they see a bunch of cops outside, including Captain Tweedy. Nancy's afraid they're too late and something's happened, but Ted carries some ice in so they can get past them, and Nancy gets past by saying she's his helper. This elicits a lot of laughter from the police force. But the Turnbull sisters tell Nancy their chauffeur was shot 2 hours ago, and that's why the police are there. Mr. Talbert, their neighbor, is there with them too in the parlor. They don't know whether the shooting was suicide or murder yet, but the Turnbull sisters say they're spooked and are thinking about moving, but Nancy tells them they would lose their property if they did that. Floretta is particularly excitable. She's like, just really flustered, you can tell. But Nancy says she'll go talk to Captain Tweedy because, as she tells the Turnbull sisters, if it was suicide, they would have nothing to worry about and could stay in the house. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't make much of a difference to me. Like, suicide, murder, someone died there, which is disturbing enough in and of itself. But I guess she's saying, you guys wouldn't be next, like you'll be fine. So Mr. Talbert says Nancy shouldn't interfere with the police's investigation, but Nancy says she's a personal friend of Captain Tweedy's and she goes to talk to him. Now, according to what Captain Tweedy is saying, he thinks it's suicide, but the DA's office, I guess, is on the fence about it. But Captain Tweedy says no doors or windows were unlocked, so there's no other explanation. So Nancy and Ted at this point go out in the hall and Nancy has him craft a suicide note. This is wild. wild to me. The Nancy in the 1930s movies does not hold back. She does a lot of questionable things in this movie, especially. I'm probably going to have to put a content warning on this one. But for this note, they write down, "Dearest, I cannot live without you. Life has been a walking shell since you threw me over." And Nancy also has Ted pretend to be on the phone when the police come back out of the room where the chauffeur was allegedly killed or killed himself. And when the police ask what they're doing, Nancy says Ted has to phone his mother every hour. Otherwise, she worries about him. So Ted is pretending to be on the phone. The operator is probably like, what on earth is this guy saying? But he's like, "Hey, Ma. Love you, Ma." And then he hangs up. But Captain Tweedy and I guess the DA, it's a little unclear, but I guess that's who he's talking to, are still arguing over a motive. And Captain Tweedy is holding the gun that was in the chauffeur's hand. He even lets Ted hold it, which this was just too much for me. I was like, there's some fine police procedure for you. I mean, if they'd been getting any fingerprinting from it, which I mean, I think fingerprinting was at least around. It's probably not to the degree that it is today, but I'm like, well, you guys just bungled that. But while this is going on, Nancy knocks a canister over onto Captain Tweedy's foot, and she conveniently drops the fake suicide note at the same time for him to find. So Captain Tweedy is like, "Where did this come from?" And Nancy's like, "I guess it was under this jar." And he says, "Okay, well that means there's proof. It was a suicide." And he points to some pictures of the chauffeur in the room, and he says maybe that was the woman he was with, and that's who he killed himself over. And then Ted goes to hand the gun back to Tweedy, and it's disassembled, and the captain is mad at him. So Floretta and Rosemary are told it was suicide, and they decide, oh, okay, well, we'll stay in the house now. But Nancy says she and Ted have to go deliver more ice, but she ends up dragging him back to the room where the chauffeur was killed, or whatever went down, and she shows Ted a bullet that she found on the floor. How Captain Tweedy overlooked this, I don't know, but it is Captain Tweedy, so. And then Nancy asks Ted a really strange question, and she's like, "Hey, can you take your belt off?" And he's like, "No, it's holding my pants up." And she's like, "Well, you can hold them up with your hands." But she wants to map out the trajectory of the bullet because she knows about where the body was because the police were pointing to this area on the ground. I guess there's other evidence that generally points to that area, but Ted surrenders his belt, and Nancy lays it out on the floor to kind of map the trajectory. She also asks Ted about the gun and what model it was. I think Ted says he thinks it was a Luger or something, but in the next scene we see Nancy picking up a paper bag with a gun in it that Ted brought by as promised. She asked him like, "Hey, do you have a gun or access to one?" Which is so unsafe for, I guess, a presumably 16-year-old to have access to that. But anyways, Ted brings it by and leaves it on Nancy's porch. And there's a note shoved into the gun barrel. Like, Ted had to roll this up and stick it in the gun barrel. And it says, "Pest, I've gone to work. Don't bother me today on account of I was docked for stalling around with you yesterday. P.S. Don't blow your head off." Wow, how romantic, Ted. I'm gonna be real honest for a second here. Nancy and Ted were working on my nerves in this movie. If it wasn't a lack of gun safety, it was potentially poisoning people, but we'll get back to that. But the next thing we see is Ted at his work, and his boss is telling him to go to Canyon Road and Glen Drive to deliver 500 pounds of ice, which is a lot of ice, to this Mrs. Brown who ordered it. And she specifically requested Ted come and bring it to her. But when he gets there, it's the middle of nowhere, and Mrs. Brown is Nancy. And she's standing there waving around this gun that Ted gave her. She called him all the way out there to have him shoot the gun for her, and he's mad, which I can't say that I blame him. So Ted starts to fill Nancy's car with these huge blocks of ice, which by the way cost $3. $3 for 500 pounds of ice. But Nancy says there's also an ordinance in the city against shooting guns, and she couldn't possibly break the law, so that's why she had to ask him out there. And he left her a note saying, "Don't bother me today," so she had to go get him to come see her in this roundabout way. Nancy is so manipulative in this movie. But anyways, but another thing about this scene that makes me so uneasy, Ted makes me so nervous because he waves the gun around. He even has it pointed at Nancy's chest at one point. That is so unsafe to do. You never do that, even if a gun isn't loaded. But Nancy tells Ted she wants to use his belt again, and he's like, "Okay, all right." Like, as if it's not enough, Nancy, that you lured him there under false pretenses. Like, you might make him lose his job. You're asking him to shoot this gun because you don't want to get in trouble for shooting this gun. I mean, you're outside of the city limits. But also, you're like, "Here, give me your belt." fault. What else are you going to ask this poor guy to do for you? So Ted shoots at the sign, and then Nancy watches the shells fall by his feet, and she says this proves that the chauffeur didn't kill himself because the shell would have been closer to the body and not across the room like it was. She says she isn't going to tell Captain Tweedy, though, because the Turnbull sisters will find out, and then they'll leave their house, and they'll lose their property per the will. So Ted goes to see how many times he hit the sign, and when he turns it around, it says, "Warning, game reserve, no shooting under penalty of law." Uh-oh. So a cop roars up on a motorcycle, and what does Nancy do? She speeds away, leaving Ted scrambling back to his ice truck. But unfortunately, because his belt is off, his pants fall down. So the officer comes up to Ted, and he's just kind of standing there awkwardly like, okay, I heard shots. This guy's standing here without his pants on. I don't know what's going on. And I don't know if you guys remember this. This was the early days of the internet, or maybe like a few years ago. Does anyone remember that guy who got known for this song that was like, pants on the ground, looking like a fool with your pants on the ground? That's kind of what Ted looks like right now. He looks like a fool with his pants on the ground. And it's all Nancy's fault. Like, why she couldn't just keep a spare ruler in her car and use that? No, she had to use Ted's belt. But this is kind of a theme that continues throughout this entire movie. Like, I saw it in the earlier movies, the last 3 we watched. Nancy would get Ted into these difficult situations that were hard to explain his way out of, but this movie is by far the worst about that. So in the very next scene, Ted is at the police station and Captain Tweedy is letting him off with a warning. Ted tries to put a piece of the gun back together for Captain Tweedy and it all falls apart again. This is a recurring thing in this movie too. Ted will shoot guns, but he doesn't seem to know how to take them apart and put them back together again. So meanwhile, while Ted is in trouble with the law, Carson is telling Nancy she needs to tell Captain Tweedy things about his investigations, which comes across as very funny because it's like, it's Captain Tweedy's investigation. Shouldn't he know what's going on? But this is kind of another trope in the Nancy Drew series. I feel like police are made to look very inept and not good at their job, unless we're talking about Chief McGinnis in the books. Like, he's great and he and Nancy partner together. It's very much like we're on the same level. Captain Tweedy in the movies is very amateur, but Carson says Nancy needs to do this, and he also tries to call Captain Tweedy, but he's told he's at the Turnbull mansion. So Nancy and Carson go out there. When they get there, Mr. Talbert and the Turnbull sisters are being questioned by Captain Tweedy, and Rosemary and Floretta say they were robbed, and again, no windows or doors were open. So Captain Tweedy is like, well, tell me what was stolen, and they start listing things, and they're like, 2 postage stamps, a package of hairpins, a paper with a laundress's phone number on it, and Captain Tweedy is just kind of standing there like, are you kidding me right now? Like, I thought you were going to tell me that valuable things were missing. So he kind of looks over at Carson and Nancy and calls them into the hallway, and he tells them, he's like, I think these women are nuts. Which this is very similar to the book. The Turnbull sisters were made to feel like they were crazy because they were quote-unquote spinsters and they were in this house by themselves, and of course they're older, maybe they're hearing things. But Carson tries to tell Captain Tweedy about Nancy's findings and her theory in regards to the bullet and it being murder, not suicide. But the captain says he doesn't want a teenager interfering, and he leaves. Which this is so just, Nancy left the suicide note, and I know it was to encourage the Turnbull sisters to stay and not leave the house, and therefore forfeit the property. But I feel like sometimes the Nancy in the 1930s movies, like, she makes more trouble for herself, which the Nancy in the books, I feel like, doesn't do this as much. She's more methodical. She's not as flighty as the Nancy in these movies. But one other thing that Floretta and Rosemary mentioned is that they heard singing. They're convinced that something supernatural is going on, but Carson asks when the house was built, and they're told it was built in the Civil War days. So Carson says, well, old houses creak, maybe those are the noises you've been hearing, and Nancy even says maybe there was a radio turned on in the neighborhood. Maybe that's what you heard. But as far as the things that were stolen, Nancy proposes that maybe a crow took these things. She comes up with this elaborate story and she's like, yeah, there's this crow that's been terrorizing River Heights. It steals things from people. It loves sparkly things. And she even gets her dad in on this. And she's like, yeah, Dad, didn't you hear about it? It was in the paper. So Nancy basically convinces Floretta and Rosemary that this crow stole the hairpins and stole the laundress's phone number. So Nancy in this movie also bends the truth a lot. She tells little white lies. But it works, and the Turnbull sisters say they're going to stay, and Carson says he has to go. But meanwhile, Nancy spies Ted in the ice truck out the window, so she says she'll ride home with him. I love how she just assumes, too. She's like, yeah, Ted will give me a ride home. But first, she asks Rosemary and Floretta if anyone has ever tried to buy their house from them. And Rosemary says, oh, some racetrack people did, but that was forever ago. So Nancy walks into the kitchen, and she walks in on Ted flirting with the kitchen girl that works for the Turnbull sisters while he's dropping off this ice for them. And he's telling her knock-knock jokes, and Nancy is jealous, you can just tell. So as they go outside the house together, Nancy says she might have to tell Ted's employer what he does when he's supposed to be working. And Ted's like, are you blackmailing me? Which, I mean, it's very obvious that Nancy is acting from a place of jealousy in this scene. And she's saying she would tell his employers, like, oh, he's flirting with people while he's supposed to be working. I'm like, you would have to tell them that he's also been running a lot of errands for you. He's been shooting guns on a game reserve. Like, I don't know. I so wanted to grab Nancy by the shoulders and be like, Nancy, just tell him how you feel. Just tell Ted that you like him, because that is what this is all about. But next thing we know, Nancy and Ted are sneaking into the Turnbull's house when Ted says, oh no, they might wake up because it's later at night. And Nancy says, oh, not to worry. She put sleeping tablets in their drinks earlier. What? Okay, so blackmail, sleeping tablets, so we poison these two older women. This is insane. Do you see what I mean? Like, the audacity of this Nancy. Like, why would you even do that? I feel like Nancy in this movie in particular operates from a stance of, well, I know better than everyone else, so I'm gonna do all these things behind the scenes that nobody knows that I'm doing, but it'll all work out in the end. But where is the line here? Like, the moral line. We're putting sleeping tablets in these older women's drinks. We're telling them that a crow stole things from their house. We're leading a police officer to believe that this investigation is based on a suicide and not a murder, which further puts these two sisters in danger, because here they are alone in this house. They believe that their chauffeur committed suicide when in fact he was murdered, and they're super vulnerable right now because they've been put to sleep by this teenager. This is crazy. This is not my Nancy. Like, the Nancy in the books would never do this. I feel like Nancy treads this line of being more of a villain in this story than a hero in this respect. But anyways, Nancy's grand scheme is to have Ted sleep in the basement and see if anyone sneaks into the Turnbull's house. So she has Ted do her dirty work a lot in this movie. But Nancy has come prepared. She even has a camera. She's ruthless. I think Nancy even tells Ted, like, I told this guy that you were borrowing the camera, so if anything happens to it, it's your fault. So Nancy goes back upstairs to hide outside, and we see Ted rigging a tripwire to the camera and laying down on a cot with this dress dummy that they got scared by a few minutes earlier. But Nancy gets held up by a mysterious man in the driveway. She pleads for her life, and she asks him not to hurt her because her dad would be so sad if anything happened to her. And then the man spins her around, and it turns out to be Carson himself. So unbeknownst to us, the audience, Nancy sent a telegram trying to lure him out of town, but it was postmarked River Heights, so Carson was on to her. So he came back to teach Nancy a lesson. He makes Nancy drive home. This scene too, I was like, what the heck, Nancy? Like, you're lying to your dad? This is not Nancy Drew. Like, mystery to solve or not, the ends do not justify the means in this case. But in the next scene, we see a man with an axe standing over a sleeping Ted. This is so creepy. But for whatever reason, the guy just steals the clothes that Ted took off. He's like sleeping in like his pajamas, and he slinks off. Now the next day, we see Nancy's at home, and she asks Effie if she put the ice sign in the window because she just has to see Ted. And Effie says yes, but they don't need more ice. And she points at the overflowing ice box. Like, it has like 7 or 8 huge blocks of ice just standing up towards the ceiling. But the Iceman does come, but it's Mr. Nickerson, Ted's dad. And when he delivers the ice, he says Ted is at the jail and he lost his job. So let's see. Ted has had his pants fall down to the ground while he's encountering a police officer while he was shooting a gun that Nancy told him to shoot. He's lost his job, and he had to sleep overnight at a creepy mansion where he could have been axe murdered. I mean, their relationship is so dysfunctional. So Nancy, Carson, and Captain Tweedy are there at the jail, and Ted walks in with the camera that Nancy gave him wearing a dress. I guess he had to take this from the Turnbull's mansion because his clothes were stolen, and he says someone stole his clothes and Nancy cost him his job. I see no lies here. These are all facts. But he also found a note next to him that said, keep away from the Turnbull house or you'll get what Phillips got. So this is proof that we're not dealing with a suicide here. We're dealing with a murder, and maybe now Captain Tweedy will realize this after Nancy has bungled every aspect of this investigation. So Captain Tweedy says he'll open the case back up as a murder investigation, and he says he'll be discreet. But right after this, when they leave, we see him making a phone call, and he asks someone to get tear gas and Tommy guns ready. Yeah, real discreet. I mean, Nancy has been anything but discreet in this movie, but Captain Tweedy doesn't even know the definition of the word. So Nancy and Ted, meanwhile, go develop the photos that he got while he was in the basement of the Turnbull's house. They're really blurry. We can see that it's a man, but that's about it. And then the next thing we see is the Turnbull sisters being led away by the police for the murder of their chauffeur. So Captain Tweedy just immediately opened it up as a murder investigation, and then he's like, yep, you guys did it. You're going to jail. Oh, and Nancy and Ted were also able to make out from that picture that it looked like the man was going towards a doorway in the basement that does not exist, so they think there's a secret passageway. So Nancy is like, I have to help the Turnbull sisters, so she's going to break into their house because it's all locked up because of the police investigating it. And she goes to break a window after the police leave, and Ted says that's breaking and entering, and he's not going to jail again. But then in their scuffle, Nancy accidentally pushes Ted right through the window. So once inside, Nancy calls Carson and asks him to help the Turnbulls. And right before she hangs up and he's like, where are you calling from? She's like, the Turnbulls. Click. So Nancy and Ted go down to the basement and they start pushing all these bricks. And Nancy has the bright idea to mark them all as they push them. So she gets some paint or some paste and she's like putting X's on all the ones they've pushed. And Ted ends up pulling a peg that's supposed to be like a coat rack, I think. And Nancy falls through the door that comes open in the wall. So they've found the passageway and how someone has been getting in. So they decide to follow the length of the tunnel, and Nancy gets scared of a frog in a puddle in the passageway, but they end up coming up into another house. And Nancy's like, what if someone's here? And then Ted shouts, Iceman, to see if anyone's home. No one answers, and they realize that it's Mr. Talbert's house, and they're in his study. Ted finds his clothes sitting on a chair, and Nancy and Ted find a map that shows a proposed racetrack that would only work out if the Turnbull's house was gone too. So about that time, Nancy and Ted see Mr. Talbert coming up the front walkway, so they hurry back down the passageway. But when he comes in, he sees the racetrack plans laying where they weren't before, and he sees wet footprints going towards the passageway. So Nancy and Ted end up hiding in the passageway, and Mr. Talbert locks his end of the passageway and goes over to the Turnbull's side, comes through the window that they broke, and he sneaks in there to find them. So he corners Nancy and Ted in the passageway, but Ted ends up tackling him, and Nancy ends up knocking Talbert out with her shoe. They try to get out of the passageway, and they realize both ends are locked, and Ted has the idea to bust a pipe to make a hole in the roof of the tunnel, but of course it starts filling with water and they're in danger of drowning. Mr. Talbert especially, because he's passed out on the floor. But the police show up and all the water ends up seeping into the ground in the front yard of the Turnbull's house, and it causes this hole to open up right under Captain Tweedy's feet, so he just disappears and his whole police force is like running to help him. So Mr. Talbert is arrested because he was trying to scare the Turnbulls out of their house, which that's what happened in the book, except it was Nathan Gomber or Nathan Gambit, and there was no murder. It was a bit darker in the movie. So Talbert is arrested, and then Nancy blurts out that Ted wrote the suicide note, and he has to go to jail again, and that's the end of the movie. So I wrote down one of the more memorable quotes. This was the only one that I wrote down for this movie, but Captain Tweedy said he bumped himself off over a babe, talking about the chauffeur. Now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about Nancy Drew, the Hidden Staircase movie. So I really wanted to like this movie more than I ended up liking this movie because I feel like the book, it's one of the better books in the classic 56 series. And I actually like The Hidden Staircase more than The Secret of the Old Clock. But there were several things about this movie that I just couldn't get past. I didn't like how Nancy took advantage of Ted. She put the Turnbull sisters in danger, and she seemed more flighty in this movie. I think that's the biggest complaint I've seen from people in the community. Like, people either really love Bonita Granville's portrayal of Nancy, or they don't like it, or they're somewhere in the middle. I generally liked her portrayal of Nancy. It was just, Nancy went to some extreme lengths to solve this mystery, and I know she does that in the books and in other pieces of media, but this felt very questionable. Like, we don't drug people. We don't blackmail people. We don't lie to our parents. I don't think this fits in with Nancy Drew's character. So when it comes to giving this movie a rating, I gave this one a 3 magnifying magnifying glass rating, I think out of the 4 movies, this was actually my least favorite. So it's kind of interesting because I was kind of the mindset before I watched these that the movies that are based on the books plots are going to be so much better. But it was kind of a toss-up. I did like the Password to Larkspur Lane adaptation, Nancy Drew Detective, but I also liked Nancy Drew Reporter and Nancy Drew Troubleshooter, which were not based on any book. So I think it can go either way. Sometimes when books get adapted to movies, we either love them or we hate them. But that concludes today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. For the next episode, we're going to be jumping back into the books, which I think will be on book number 101, The Missing Millionaires. So if you like books where Nancy goes to a boarding school and there's high stakes, someone is kidnapped and there's ransom notes sent, you're definitely going to like this one. It kind of gave me some Warnings at Waverly Academy vibes. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.